fundamentally agree more. But I'm going to propose to you that for all of this to happen, we still have some massive protocol infrastructure challenges to solve before most of these ideas are ever going to become feasible. So, as a company and as a project, we've been building to solve some of these core infrastructure problems. I want to talk to you a little bit about blockchain protocols and this concept of interoperability and give you the perspective of what we're working on at Aon. Our team's based in Toronto. Some of the work that we've already accomplished. For most of you, this will be an introduction to Aon. If you want to learn more about where we're at in our progress, we are hosting a meetup tonight here in Miami at the Lab Miami at 7:30. So please join us. You can find out more on our Twitter account if you want to find out a little bit more about the progress. So Aon is an ongoing project. It's a project that we launched in March of last year to solve this kind of global problem of scalability on the blockchain. And although we use the term interoperability, I kind of see these two things as being tools to the same outcome. A more scalable infrastructure for us to build a decentralized society and decentralized industries for the future. And interoperability between all of these existing protocols is a really, really key piece to that. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit of our thoughts, and then by all means, I've got a few members from the team here with me from Toronto. We're here to answer any questions if you have any after that. So a little bit of background on us. When we started in this industry, early 2014, we had this very exclusive focus on the enterprise market. What was going to be the needs of the enterprise market in the context of private networks and scalable systems to replace all these legacy infrastructures that they work on today? And as you've seen over the course of the last 4 years, there's a lot of development happening in this concept of private enterprise solutions. Some that we've built over the course of these years, working with large stock exchanges and banks, healthcare providers and governments, but also projects like Hyperledger and R3, Chain.com, and a long list of other private enterprise solutions. In parallel to that, we had kind of the other end of the spectrum. We had this end of the spectrum that was focusing on the public crypto markets. These systems that are so important to everybody in this room, like Bitcoin and Ethereum and Monero and all sorts of new protocols getting proposed on a very frequent basis. And more recently, if you've been following the trends in the industry, you've been seeing this third bucket arise, this concept of projects focusing on interoperability. And this is something that we've kind of very much adhered to, a focus in our design, relationships that we've been developing with projects like Wanchain, who you may have heard their presentation earlier today, projects like Icon in South Korea, Cosmos, Polkadot, Arc, and many others focusing on this concept of interoperability. But what we decided to do in our design was actually go after an all-encompassing solution, a solution that could kind of check the box across all these different verticals, but something that could also integrate into the existing systems that we've already built and put so much value into. So when we focused on designing Aon, it came down to a focus on a system that could be used both privately, publicly, a system that was built for scale, and a system that was designed to interoperate with any other system out there, whether blockchain, distributed ledger, or old school legacy centralized systems that also need to be integrated into this fabric that we're building for the future. So this kind of encompasses what it is that we're building. We're building a new public system that launches within the next couple of months that has a very, very specific focus on bridging in, and I'll walk you through this design that we call bridging, all of the other blockchains that we all kind of put so much value in today. So what can Aon do in that context? We've kind of simplified this down into 3 core features of Aon, and we call these federate, scale, and spoke. So if you think about federate in this context, what I mean by that is how do you move transactional data off of one blockchain, allow it to arrive in another blockchain without ever relying on a centralized intermediary. Probably most of you here that have been engaged in this space have acted through exchanges, through centralized wallet providers, potentially directly being issued from centralized actors like ICOs, but we have not yet cracked this challenge of how do I move data or value between blockchains in a decentralized way. The irony of our industry is that all this value we've created, we've kind of re-centralized into the new bank of this new industry, the exchange in many cases. The other concept we have is this concept of scaling. And when we think of scaling, we actually kind of fundamentally looked at it in 2 ways. How do you scale an existing public blockchain, but also how do you take advantage of a multitude of public blockchains or blockchains in general and allow applications to coexist on top of many blockchains. So today, if you want to build an application, you build it on a single infrastructure. If you want to build an Ethereum application, it's built on Ethereum. If you want to build an EOS application, it's built on EOS. But what if we could build applications that were natively sitting on top of many blockchains, where part of my application logic and part of my application scale, and some of those transactions could be segregated into multiple networks to allow for that efficient scale. So this is where interoperability and scale kind of come together hand in hand. And finally is this concept of spokes, this idea that if you have a hub network and you have a unique design and a unique purpose, you can create a connected spoke that can be optimized for the needs of an industry, optimized for the needs of a use case, and optimized for the realities of the counterparties in that industry. So not everybody mistrusts each other the same way that Bitcoin miners mistrust each other. So can we build these like hybrid solutions that allow you to go from completely centralized to completely decentralized and everything in the middle and allow them all to stitch back together? So a little bit of what that looks like from an architectural perspective. This is very simplified, and I'll kind of give you a broader picture before I end my presentation in terms of what we think the future might look like. So in this context, there's three general actors. Kind of the big circle on this diagram is the Aon network, the network that we're building that essentially acts in two functions. One is a public system with a very scalable function to build applications and second layer smart contract logic, but also as kind of a routing network, a network that allows you to point other blockchains to it to act as a registry of all the networks out there so that I can move application logic from one blockchain to another. So Aon in that context is both a public blockchain and a public routing system for other blockchains. These lines kind of sticking off, going off into other directions are what we call bridges. Bridges that can be managed as centrally or decentralized as necessary depending on where their destination is. If they're going from regulated centralized stock markets into regulated central bank issued government currencies, there's probably a design that's appropriate for that. But if they're going from Bitcoin to Ethereum, there's probably a different design that's appropriate for that. So how do we build a bridge mechanism, a communication protocol that allows us to move this data to validate its authenticity across chains and reward people for participating in these bridges? And I'll talk about that role of rewarding people for participating in these bridges. And finally, you have these other networks, these networks that sit on the periphery of the Aon network that we call participating blockchains. Blockchains that can be of any DNA and of any category, either different protocols or copies of the same protocol that we're building right now. So both private and public. If you want to connect an R3 Corda database to an Ethereum network, how do you do that efficiently so that you can build an application that essentially stitches together all of these different systems into one? So with that in mind, this concept of three layers, the main chain, the bridge, and the participating blockchain, I'll walk you through the actors and the different types of interactions that we see when people are using Aon as we get ready to launch it. So there's 5 general types of behaviors that we anticipate when people start interacting with this network. One, we've noticed, especially over the course of the last 6 months, an explosion of new businesses wanting to enter into the blockchain space. People with very, very deep domain expertise in a particular vertical, but call it a lack of understanding or a lack of experience in the blockchain industry. What has been the trend recently, and I think should probably cease to be the trend, is that everybody feels the need to become deep blockchain protocol engineers and resolve problems that have already been solved multiple times over. So how do you build a set of tools and a framework so that new startups, new businesses, and the enterprises of the future can build efficiently with a business model in mind on top of a system that is built with their needs in mind? So we're building a pretty significant layer of tools to support that startup, that new company that wants to build their business model on top of the Aon network without having to go reinvent the protocol underneath it. The second is the enterprise, and this is kind of a big part of our DNA as a team, has been this 4 years spent back and forth learning the requirements of these large institutions, understanding their hesitations with decentralized technologies, but also understanding their requirements if they were to adopt them. So how do we make this a comfortable transition for systems, in some cases, that have not been upgraded for 50 or 60 years in the legacy industries that, whether we like it or not, we all rely on a day-to-day basis? The third is the existing dApp developer, the developer that has been adamantly building applications on top of Ethereum, Ethereum Classic, Bitcoin, you name it, as these networks launch, increasingly Quantum and other systems that are essentially captivating the imagination of developers in this industry, but everybody is being forced to pick one protocol on which I'm going to build my idea, which kind of equates to this concept that in the enterprise market we call vendor lock-in. How do I know where's the right infrastructure? How do I know what's the right network? How do I know what's the right set of tools? How can we simplify that process for the dApp developer so that ideas can get built irrespective of what infrastructure they're being developed on? Finally, at the system administration of our network, we've got 2 kind of very critical roles. One is the validator. This person plays the role of essentially validating authenticity of transactions and maintaining the integrity of the system. You know, I'll give you a snapshot of our roadmap to give you some context into how our consensus algorithm is designed and developed. But essentially, this person is critical to making sure that there is, in fact, a decentralized reward system in place to ensure integrity and authenticity in the Aeon system. And finally, the bridge builder, which is something somewhat unique to projects that you may not have heard of in many contexts before, but essentially incentivizing third parties to connect networks to each other. So we're publishing a design for what we call a bridge, and this bridge design essentially allows you to witness and validate transactions across chains. But this bridge design also requires that a certain number of nodes exist to play that role. And these are the bridge builders, the builders of these connections between blockchains that are essentially going to be earning rewards as they validate transactions across chains. So if I'll dive into that, very, very high level. What that looks like is if you have a group of nodes sitting between the Aeon blockchain and the Ethereum blockchain, then that group of nodes essentially needs to be able to witness a specific type of unique signature associated with a transaction, to be able to witness that there's a cross-chain transaction taking place. As a group, they all need to agree that they witnessed the same cross-chain transaction, then they need to pass it on to the next chain. So how do you create that kind of lightweight consensus mechanism to allow for these bridges to get built and for a reward to get paid out as data traverses these bridges from one blockchain to the other? So these are kind of the 5 key roles. Obviously, there's a lot more depth that we can go into tonight, so I'd encourage you to come to our meetup tonight if you're more interested. But a couple of example use cases. What does this mean? Why is it useful? And why are we actually focusing on this problem? So one, you often hear of this concept of decentralized exchanges. Decentralized exchanges, in many cases, are great ideas, but often come with the challenge of crossing blockchains. Decentralized exchange on top of Ethereum for ERC20 tokens, somewhat novel idea 6 months ago, solvable technical challenge. But now this idea that I need to move coins between blockchains is actually pretty challenging if you don't want to centralize it. So one example of a use case. The second one that particularly appealed to us is we realized increasingly in the enterprise market that these companies that were building private blockchains were actually getting really, really curious about public blockchains. But it didn't mean that it was going to be one or the other. It might mean that there are some of their systems that are restricted by regulation, restricted by privacy requirements to be secluded into semi-private or completely private environments, but there might be other parts of their processes that they're comfortable opening up onto public systems. So how do you create this ability to connect hybrid applications that sit both on top of private and public blockchains without making it inefficient, expensive, or centralized? Finally, the idea of interchain applications that will span across multiple public blockchains. So if you have, a simple example, if I wanted to build a smart contract that witnessed the change in state of my medical data, which might be managed on a private hospital network, and then have that smart contract execute a payment on a third blockchain, I might have a simple application that has to span across 3 blockchains. So how do I create that efficiency so that you don't have to actually go through any frictions in the process of moving that application across? And finally, when we look at the challenges that have come across some of these major public blockchains, we see a huge scaling challenge in a very small number of solutions. So we are trying to propose an alternative that people can use as a scaling solution to the existing kind of mainstream public blockchains that are out there. So if there's 2 major ICOs hitting Ethereum on the same day at the same time, very, very challenging today. So how do you create these off-chain scaling solutions that essentially allow you to leave one blockchain, create a transaction record, and then bring it back onto the blockchain with significantly less computational requirement? So quick snapshot into our roadmap and where we're at today. We've been kind of heads down in development on this since research started back in February, March, and this has been kind of an ongoing development effort for our team. We're getting very close to the launch of our first test network, which should be available in the next couple of weeks. And then finally, we'll have kind of a live operating, rewarding network sometime in the next few weeks, in the next few months, followed by a relatively long and robust roadmap that I'm be happy to talk to anybody in more detail about, read about it on our white paper and interact with us online. We've got a lot of community management going on and events that we'll be hosting around the world. So if you want to learn more about this, by all means, please reach out to us. I couldn't get away with this presentation if I didn't first show you what the vision looks like for the future. This is what we envision in some small sample Aeon as an ecosystem looking like. And I threw some examples of projects up here, but essentially we want to stop looking at blockchains as standalone isolated systems and start to imagine what the Internet of the blockchain world looks like. And the Internet of the blockchain world looks a lot like Aeon in our mind. So before I kind of step off the stage, I do want to take a moment to to give recognition to the team back in Toronto. We're actively growing. We're looking at setting up our second and third engineering centers around the world in the coming months. But we'd love to hear from you, so please reach out. If you have any questions, we'll be around. Thank you so much.
Matthew Spoke, ladies and gentlemen. Nicely done. Next up, we got Jason King from Academy.